Welcome, everyone, to Webinar 3 on Argumentation and Evidence for Historical Argumentation, generously sponsored by the Library of Congress and Teaching with Primary Sources. We're once again joined by Dr. Christopher Hamner, who is going to lead us through some content, some advice, some modeling on argumentation and evidence in history. And then we're going to be able to spend some time tonight talking about the final assignment and getting ready for the final assignment. So if you want to go to the housekeeping slides, please, Dr. Hamner. As always, and I'm going to put the captions on as I'm reminded, as always, if you have any questions tonight as we're going along, if they are technical questions, if there are clarification questions, please use the Q&A box. I do have the live captioning turned on right now. If you find that distracting to you, you can go ahead and minimize it. At the end of tonight's webinar, after the Q&A portion, you will have access to a survey. Please complete that survey so that we can mark your attendance credit. That is how we mark attendance here, as you all know. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to post a PDF of tonight's slides, and there's going to be 2 different slideshows. Dr. Hamner and I have separate approaches for this evening. You're going to find a recording of tonight and some other materials that will help you with your final assignment. Everything will be available under Webinar 3 materials on Google Classroom. A reminder that responses to Module 3 discussion, where you are workshopping one another's, or I'm sorry, you are providing feedback for one another's thesis statements, is due on Monday the 10th. And then in that same week, Friday the 14th, you will have assignment 3 due. And assignment 3 is something that we will talk about later on in tonight's webinar. And the next module, which is the final module for this course, will also be available on Friday the 14th. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Hamner. That's everything I have for housekeeping.
Thank you so much. And a big thanks to everybody who is out there tonight for taking an hour out of your schedule this week to talk a little bit more about historical thinking and change over time. I hope you're having a great week wherever you are. It is cold and windy and rainy, and there's actually a tornado warning here where I am in Northern Virginia. As my advisor would have said, this is good weather to be inside doing historical thinking. And I have been grading all afternoon. So this webinar with you guys is like the highlight of my day, as I know you can appreciate. There's not a lot of things that feel quite as good as being done with your grading. We have been talking about change over time and how we understand it as scholars. And we spent the first webinar kind of going over practicing and modeling the core set of historical thinking skills: sourcing, close reading, corroboration, and contextualization. We spent the second webinar last month talking a little bit about lenses that scholars use in order to try to fit those things together, to look at primary sources as puzzle pieces that can tell us something larger about the past. And so if our entire goal in the seminar is to think about the transformation from the raw material of primary sources to the final polished product, the first 2 webinars focused more on the raw material. The last 2 webinars are going to focus more on the finished product. How do we think about arguments, and later how do we conceptualize them? How do we organize them? How do we present them to our audiences? And this is a set of skills I continue to work on, not only with my students, but also in my own work. It is just a constant process of refinement and development. We've talked about historical interpretation as the process of assembling all of our primary source evidence into a coherent argument. And a lot of that revolves in the study of history around questions of cause and effect. Why are things happening? And that was, in fact, one of the primary themes of the second webinar. Before we jump into tonight's material, I want to circle back to a couple of questions that we had in the feedback box. So many of you asked about agency, or mentioned that this was a difficult concept to communicate with students, and that's super common. It is a hard concept, and every time we have done this historical thinking webinar, this has been the number one thing that people wanted to talk a little bit more about. And so I want to take just a minute or two to talk about ways of thinking about agency that might be helpful for you or helpful for your students. Remember, we're thinking about the power, leverage, pressure, the ability to influence events. And one starter question that is usually in the back of my mind when I'm trying to work through a set of primary sources is who or what is making this action happen? What is putting this into motion? Another useful way to think about this is in terms of credit and blame or responsibility. There are different ways of thinking about this same concept of who is exerting influence, who is exerting pressure. Often a good way to get some signals about, where the pressure is coming from is where fingers are being pointed. Who is being held up for credit for this achievement or who is being blamed for it? And most of us do this pretty naturally in other parts of our lives. And so I would encourage you to think about other places where you can see issues of agency or credit, blame, cause and effect playing out. News is really common. So let's go all the way back to 2023. It seems like a lifetime ago. If you can recall, the previous Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, was ousted after I think only a year in the position. And that was a big headline, but how he came to be ousted turned out to be a little more complicated. And depending which papers you were reading, you might have gotten different ideas. So the Wall Street Journal in October of 2023 wrote a piece that argued that then Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz had been the person who ousted Kevin McCarthy. And their argument there hinged on the fact that Gaetz and a few other Republicans had written the rules of the speakership so that any member of the House could call a snap vote up or down. That was a big change in the speakership. And in October, Gaetz invoked it and was able to get Kevin McCarthy ejected from the speakership. And in this headline saying, Matt Gaetz did this. But if you looked in other places, you might get other explanations. So the National Republican Congressional Committee, 2 days later, put out a different statement. And you notice in this headline, they're placing the credit or the blame, the responsibility somewhere entirely different, that it was Democrats, particularly their leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who were responsible for getting Kevin McCarthy deposed from the speakership. And so we've got two different visions of agency there surrounding this same event. Two different stories, two different organizations are explaining something in different ways. And that's really common in thinking about pressure or leverage or influence. What is making things happen? One of our sandboxes in a previous iteration dealt with a terrible, terrible flood in Pennsylvania that was unbelievably destructive to an entire valley and deadly. And some of the news clippings, you can see one here on the left, talk about this as more or less an act of God, right? It was just, torrential rains and flooding often follows rain. No one can be held responsible except for Mother Nature. But we saw in the same collection of primary sources some other things that actually are a little more pointed. And this is a political cartoon that shows a bunch of rich fat cats who had built a dam to create a sort of hunting and fishing preserve for their own specific enjoyment, and suggesting that it was the responsibility of this small group of ultra wealthy people who had wound up flooding the entire region. So you've got two visions of what is making the flood happen. One is kind of, just Mother Nature, or the elements and forces of nature, and another one is very specific about human beings. And whenever historians are thinking about agency, we're thinking about the ability to make decisions. But the thing that I want to underline here is that when historians talk about agency, what we're really doing is making an argument about power and relationships and why things happen. We can't prove these things, or they might both be true, but we are presenting an argument that says this is the main reason, or this is the only reason, or this is, not a reason why things happened. And you can see this all the time if you're watching sports or you're listening to sports talk radio. People who say that they hate history and don't understand any of this stuff are often very good at making cases about cause and effect. When it's, say, Super Bowl 51 here, why does this game turn out the way that it does? Is it about the players? Is it about the refs? Is it about the coaches? Is it even bigger? Is it about ownership and drafts and things that happen in the offseason? How many different things are influencing the events that you watch on the field? So when I'm thinking about agency, I'm often just kind of trying to refresh myself and make explicit what's going on, who is trying to make the thing happen, who's trying to prevent it, because a lot of the things we're looking at in history are people pushing against each other. And then why does it happen to be going in a particular direction? Why is one side getting the upper hand? We saw this just last Friday, the Oval Office meeting between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And if you watch any of those clips, you saw kind of an interesting uh, conversation that became very heated at points between these three leaders. And there was a lot of discussion about agency. People want things to happen. People are trying to prevent things from happening. There's political agency, there's diplomatic agency, there's economic agency. Where is the power coming from? Who is able to push and in what ways? And at one point, President Trump interrupted the Ukrainian president and said, "You don't have the cards. You can't come in here and talk like that because you don't have the cards." And my historians here said, wow, that's an argument about agency, about power and who has it and who lacks it. So this is a really good skill to practice over and over again. And as you start looking more carefully, you'll start to see things of like, oh, I can see someone's putting some pressure here. If you're working in the Typhoid Mary sandbox, we got a great story here about the woman called Typhoid Mary dropping a lawsuit. There's a couple of things scattered in there. They don't use the word agency. They don't talk about power, but you can see something has happened. Different people have been influencing the outcome, and the situation is resolving in a particular way because of that interplay. The other thing that came up in a number of the comments from our previous webinar was a request for a little more discussion of corroboration, which I'm happy to provide. Um, Maybe the best thing that I can point out is that corroboration has multiple meanings. A few of you are concerned that corroboration was about fact checking and that you had to have students go and double and triple and quadruple check every fact or detail that they found in a primary source. And some people expressed a concern that that might be time consuming, and you are right. That kind of corroboration has a place in history, but an even bigger place in journalism. Most times I don't have my students uh, fact check, double check, triple check everything. When I'm talking about corroboration as a historian, I'm thinking about where do these things agree and disagree? And sometimes it's very subtle. And it has to do with perspective. It has to do with someone's moment in time or their political affiliation or their preferences towards outcome, or whether they're speaking publicly or privately. So if you're working on the Enrollment Act, one thing that was kind of interesting as I was rounding up those sources was to note that there are some Northerners who are making a set of claims about what is happening with potential Union soldiers. We've got an example here where someone is speaking in a public way. This is published and meant to be read everywhere, and making some claims about what's happening. And then a different document is an April 21st letter from 1863 from Schuyler Colfax to Abraham Lincoln. And this has a slightly different theory about why there is so much resistance in the Union to the Enrollment Act as it was first proposed. And so I'm not trying to fact check, double check, and triple check, but mostly to kind of bring these things together and say, wow, this person speaking publicly is giving one set of reasons for something. A different person speaking privately to the president is giving a slightly different set of reasons. What is the fact that both of these people exist in the same moment but are making different kinds of claims potentially going to tell us? One of the things that comes up over and over again with my students is, that there's not an answer to this. And I have to work really hard to discourage my students and sometimes to discourage myself from this idea that there's a right answer to agency here. I just have to look at the document and then I can check the box and be done. And I think of these historical thinking skills and lenses as like a lockpick kit. You try all the different tools, you kind of jiggle them in the lock, you try them in different combinations, you try working them together. And then usually with enough effort and enough trial and error, something is going to pop loose. The hasp of the lock is going to open and you have a valuable insight. But you have to just learn to kind of lean into the frustration at first, because in my experience, frustration in the early phases just kind of comes with the territory. It is the price of getting that insight that you want. All right, let's spend the next 15 minutes talking about kind of nuts and bolts stuff about historical argument, and then I will hand off the microphone to my partner who's going to walk us through a fantastic exercise about organization. I lead off in my classes with a pretty straightforward claim that historical argument is making a claim about the past that is supported with evidence from primary sources. But I have to qualify that a little bit because there are better and worse historical arguments. There are more compelling and less compelling historical arguments. And the best ones make a claim that is interesting in some way. And usually the test there is that you're making an argument that a reasonable person might take the opposite side of. So you could make a historical argument that in the 1990s, the Chicago Bulls were a dominant team in the NBA. I was alive, living in Wisconsin in the 1990s. It would be hard to argue with that claim. The Michael Jordan era Bulls were pretty good. Similarly, you could make the argument that the 1963 I Have a Dream speech was an important moment in the civil rights movement. These are often the kind of arguments that my undergrads want to make. And I think often it's because they feel like if I say something that is so uncontroversial, then I've set myself a pretty easy job. Like I will definitely be able to prove that the Bulls were dominant. And the problem with these arguments is that nobody is reasonably going to take the other side of that. It would be pretty hard to say, no, the I Have a Dream speech just went by, didn't really get a lot of notice, and was not very important. And scholars call those kinds of arguments straw men, right? They don't fight back very much. And so what I'm always doing is kind of pushing my students to go a little bit further and to make sure that the argument that they're going to make is the kind of thing that a reasonable person could push back against. So it would be one thing to say Martin Luther King Jr. was a key figure in the civil rights movement, but nobody would argue that he was unimportant. Sometimes there's a more interesting argument tucked in there. So if we can push a little further, we can get something that is compelling. Martin Luther King Jr. was a key figure in the civil rights movement, not particularly compelling. Martin Luther King Jr.'s intellect and religiosity made him the key figure of the civil rights movement. Now that is interesting and that is compelling. And one of the ways I can tell is that you could take the opposite side, and scholars have. People have said, as in that third paragraph, while Martin Luther King Jr. served as an important organizer, most of the actual work for civil rights was undertaken by scores of local groups. And so now we've got something that is a claim that someone might actively argue against, and we've got something more interesting to work with. And so just coming up with an argument that is worth defending is a really important key step. The other thing that I want to talk with you about tonight is starting to practice self-diagnosing your own writing and the difference between descriptive writing and analytical writing. And this turns out to be really useful in your own work, in your students' NHD projects, being able to tell the difference and to know what to use when. For my purposes, I think of descriptive writing talking about who, what, when, and where, kind of the factual first questions a journalist would ask. Analytical writing is talking about the why and the how. And so one of the distinctions we could make is that descriptive writing is much more concerned with factual information, and analytical writing is concerned with meaning. Facts are the kinds of things that we can establish from primary sources. Meaning is the way we interpret and give significance to the facts. So we've got two different kinds of writing that are almost always present in a good piece of historical scholarship. Now, where do we look for them and what should the ratio be? I like to go back to the old stereo adjuster knob. If you're my age, within a decade, you may have had a first stereo that had a single tone knob on there. You turned it one direction, you got more bass. You turn it the other direction, you got more treble. And I like to use the single knob analogy here because I think in like a 2-page essay, it's a really good stand-in. If you're turning up the treble, it means you're getting less bass. If you turn up the bass, it means you're getting less treble. In a 2-page essay, you've got a fixed amount of space. And if you turn in your knob so there's more descriptive writing, you're going to get something that looks like this. Not a whole lot of room for analysis. And I would say that the majority of my students' first drafts, particularly, undergraduates, heavy on the description, right? In fact, a few of them want to go like all the way to 12, right? So they're handing in essays that look like this, where it's filled with facts and maybe just a tiny bit of interpretation or analysis. I think one of the reasons that we do this, and I do it too, is that we feel a little bit more comfortable writing about facts because we feel like I'm not going to be challenged on this. This is something you can establish the veracity of from a source. The date is right. The number of votes is correct. The outdoor temperature is correct. These are things that nobody's going to push back on. Writing analysis is a little more vulnerable because you have to stick your neck out and you have to make some claims. I strongly urge my students, and I try to police my own work, to keep the knob between description and analysis almost at a 1-to-1 ratio. I think a really good piece of historical work is balanced. And I use this color coding from my time back at the Writing Center as a graduate student. I had a student I was working with on a session, and I talked about different kinds of writing, and the student pulled out some colored highlighters and began to do this exact exercise right on the page. She just invented it right there in front of me, and it turned out to be so useful that I'm still using it 25 years later. So I think at first, if you or your students are struggling with it, we're going to do some diagnostic exercises that help you figure out what kind of writing you're doing and about how the mixture works. So let's take a look at a few examples, and then we'll do a talk aloud. These are pulled from the Battle of Gettysburg because I'm teaching the undergraduate class in the Civil War right now. My brain is just in 1863. But let me give you a sample paragraph that you could write about that battle. And let's kind of go through sentence by sentence and decide whether we're looking at descriptive writing or analytical writing. So Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was much smaller than the Union Army. That's a fact. I mean, that feels like description. His men marched on short rations and many of them lacked shoes. Okay, also descriptive writing. These are factual things we could verify in primary sources. Nevertheless, the troops marched towards Gettysburg confident of victory. Also a fact, we have letters and memoirs and diary entries that establish that. They arrived on July 1st. We've got a whole paragraph there that is almost purely description. It's just listing details about the events. And so it doesn't really make an argument. It's not telling us anything about why these things happened or how they happened. Here's a second paragraph that's about the exact same battle, but has a slightly different mixture of description and analysis. While Lee's Confederate army was smaller than the opposing Union force, numbers alone would not decide the outcome of the battle. So you've got kind of half and half. We've got a descriptive observation and then some interpretation. Because they had already prevailed 5 times over their larger, better equipped foe, Lee's men marched towards Gettysburg confident of victory. Same thing. We've got some interpretation followed up by a fact. The last sentence, leadership would be more important than numbers in the battle. That's just pure interpretation. It is making a claim about what is going to be determinative in this big Civil War battle. So we've actually got some serious analysis in there. And note that there are kind of key words that good historical writers use, while, because, that are like little flashing signs that say, this is where the analysis is happening. This is where the interpretation is happening. It is making some cases about cause and effect. Why is this thing happening? And that's really what historical interpretation is about. It's not just dumping a whole bunch of factual information on the table for your reader. That's an important precursor, but really effective historical interpretation has to do more than just take stock of all the facts that your research has turned up. You need to explain to the reader how the facts fit together and what they are telling us about the past. That's really the engine of historical interpretation. Once you have done the research or your students have done the research, then fitting them together and making some sort of arguable claim about what's happening and why. So let's do a series of 3 diagnostic exercises, our favorite quiz. What I'm going to do is give a sample paragraph. I'm going to read it aloud. And what I want you to do is listen, kind of imagine you've got a red highlighter or a yellow highlighter in your hand, and then think whether what you're hearing is mostly descriptive writing, mostly analytical writing, or whether it's a mixture of both. And we'll do this 3 times. So are we ready to play along with the home game?
We're all set.
Outstanding. Well, let's go. Here's our paragraph. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. It would go on to sell 300,000 copies in the United States. The evil slave owner Simon Legree became one of the most infamous villains of 19th century fiction.
Okay.
I'll leave that up there for one more second. And remember, we're going through, are we looking at mostly descriptive writing, mostly analytical writing, or a mixture of both?
So folks are responding. Responses are
Great.
coming in a steady stream.
We need to equip everybody with the home clickers, and we'll start to put we'll start to have a timer on this exercise.
Yep. We're at just about 30 seconds. So how about 10 more seconds? For those of you who have yet to make a selection, please do so. But it does look like we have a clear winner.
Okay. I want to also point out, partly because of the great feedback that the participants in this workshop have given us, I've been bringing these back in my own classes, and they're terrific. And one of the great things that they do, it's not just that students, it's the participation is fun, but then it gives us something to talk about. It gives us something to kind of go over and say, okay, who picked this? Who picked that? Justify your decision. And we've had some really interesting conversations that way. All right. Tell us who won.
Time to end the poll.
Okay.
With 64% of the responses, 64% of people responded mostly descriptive writing.
Okay.
No one chose mostly analytical writing.
Nobody.
36, so about a third of people said a mix of both.
Okay. I had that one scored as mostly descriptive writing myself. Let's play again.
Okay.
Same exercise, different paragraph. The election of 1876 was the most important and consequential election of the 19th century. The Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes only prevailed because self-interested politicians in his own party struck a corrupt bargain to deliver the victory. That bargain was the reason that Reconstruction failed to deliver racial justice to Southern blacks. Leave it up for a second. Same deal. If you were highlighting this with a student, How much of it is going red for descriptive? How much of it is going gold for analysis?
All right. Poll is launched.
Let's put it up.
Again, responses are coming in very, very quickly.
Cool.
People are ready for this one.
Good.
They are
Oh,
ready.
there's one more after this.
Uh,
Tripling up tonight. We're
uh-huh.
throwing the last one in
Uh-huh.
completely free.
Uh-huh. All right. 5 more seconds. Okay. The results are in.
Okay.
Percent of folks said mostly descriptive writing.
Okay.
A whopping 85% said mostly analytical writing, and 12% said a mix of both.
I had this one scored as mostly analytic myself, but as I look over these, there's always going to be a little bleed through. I mean, it is impossible to write purely in one way or the other. So if you're seeing little, uh, pinpricks of the other kind, they're there.
Mhm.
But kind of as a whole, I drafted these up to be leaning heavily on one side or the other. Let's play one more time.
Okay.
This one's going to jump us out of the 19th century into the 20th. The Equal Rights Amendment, first approved by the House in 1971, remains one of the great missed opportunities in American politics. The amendment enjoyed bipartisan support in Congress. It eventually received 35 of the required 38 state ratifications. Ultimately, it was doomed by the work of Phyllis Schlafly, who argued that the amendment would actually leave women with fewer rights by removing legal protections and exposing them to the draft. Same
Okay.
deal. Imagine you're going through it with a student.
Poll
Have we
is
got
on.
mostly descriptive, mostly analytical, or a mix of both?
Okay. The rapid responses, the increase in the rapid responses is marked. People were
Wow.
absolutely ready for this one.
We should do like two more, and then we would have. I mean,
Yeah.
we could get a team of crack quiz show.
Incredible.
That'd be awesome. We could take everybody out to the bar trivia contest and clean
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
or at least answer quickly.
Yeah. Don't say that we haven't prepared you for that. All right. I feel confident that those of you who will respond have responded, so I'm ending the poll right now.
Cool.
And reporting back, 7% and 7% both said mostly descriptive writing and mostly analytical writing, but the greater majority, 85% of you selected a mix of both.
I had this one scored out as a mix, and I tried pretty hard to kind of pair up a flat statement of fact with an interpretation. So if you had a mix, you saw what I was trying to put out there. I'm going to turn the microphone over to my partner, who's going to take us the
Right.
rest of the way, and
Okay.
I will be sitting here waiting for Q&A.
Great. Wonderful. So I can now share my screen. I'm trying something a little bit different tonight, sharing a whole desktop. So I have a couple of things that I'd like to show you this evening, and I hope that this is a better way for me to do that. Okay. Dr. Hamner, can you just confirm for me that you can see everything just fine?
I sure can.
Okay, great. All right. So, as you all are well aware, when I come on the screen here and I'm talking to you, I talk a little more nuts and bolts about the work of this course and the assignments that you are completing for historical argumentation. You are well aware now as well that assignment 3, your argumentation plan draft, is available to you. You may have taken a look at it. You may have started working on it. If you haven't, that's perfectly okay. It is important that you have the time and the space here within this webinar, that you are thinking more about analytical and descriptive writing, that is more present in front of mind before you really dive into the work of doing assignment 3. So I'm going to give a little bit of a description of what that's going to look like at the outset. And then I'm going to spend some time thinking about or sharing with you all how to take evidence, to organize evidence, and to begin making an argument. Okay, so for assignment 3, your argumentation plan draft. You're going to continue on with the same primary source packet that you have chosen since the beginning. So either Typhoid Mary or the Enrollment Act. And the goals of this assignment are to have you practice skills of argumentation, to complete a draft of an argumentation plan. And here I really want to emphasize that this is a draft of a plan. So for those of you who are thinking that you need to conduct a full historical investigation and study and report that final work of history that Dr. Hamner often introduces a webinar with, that's not this. This is putting the pieces in motion so that you know the process of taking primary source evidence, collecting and identifying new pieces of evidence, putting them in conversation within the context of secondary sources, and start to organize the sources so that you can begin to make a historical argumentation a historical argument that would eventually be the work of history. But we're not going to be fully through that process in this course. This is more of the back end so that you can get organized and you can have practice getting up into that point. The final thing that you're going to be working on for this assignment that you've been working on since Module 2 is focusing on thesis revision and re-revision and re-revision. So you'll see that when I checked in with you all on Google Classroom on Monday, I made an outline of just how many times you will have revised your thesis. And as I was typing that, it did seem like a lot to me, or it surprised me at how many times that you will have the opportunity to revise your thesis. And a lot, certainly not that that's a bad thing, but how many wonderful opportunities you have to look at your work, to expand one area, maybe contract and tighten another. But you really have the time and space and opportunity, luxury really, to think very critically and creatively and expansively about the thesis statements that you are creating based on the primary source research that you are doing. So this is, again, just a brief look at what assignment 3 is going to ask you to do. So in addition to working on your thesis, what you're going to be doing is thinking about how you are going to do the work, how you're planning to do the work to then prove that thesis, that argument that you are making, the big argument that you're making. And the way that we're doing this is by having you identify 3 different sub-arguments, organizing your research, doing analysis that is based on these sub-arguments that you are making, helping you to address the so what question. What's at stake? Why does it matter that you're making the argument that you're making in your thesis statement? So you're going to be identifying 3 sub-arguments, as I've said, and 3 seems just like a nice number to start with. Certainly, there are much more expansive ways that you can create sub-arguments. Even your National History Day students might create far more than 3 sub-arguments. But we're kind of keeping with that fairy tale rule here, the 3 little bears, the 3 just it is a nice number that is approachable for very good reason. So as you are identifying and creating those sub-arguments, you're going to be drawing from the relevant primary sources that you have found, identifying other ones if need be, and really here doing the work of practicing skills of historical analysis and argumentation. So at every step along the way, we want to give you as many opportunities as possible to really practice the things that Dr. Hamner is introducing to you and modeling for you. Okay. So Module 3 can be kind of a scary turning point for many folks who are in historical argumentation because, as Dr. Hamner was saying with his experience with his students, it can be scary and you might feel vulnerable in making an argument. So what we want to do is make sure that you feel well prepared to make an argument, that you feel like you have the resources available so that you can do it yourself in this assignment and you can help your students also make arguments. And I have this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon here because to illustrate that these are not the kind of arguments that we're asking that you make. Historical arguments are not just 2 people, often are not just 2 people yelling at one another, but are really carefully constructed, researched, reasoned statements that you make that are potentially provable, that people can talk about, that people can really dig into. One of the tools that my colleague Lynn O'Hara developed for use within her own classroom when she was a classroom teacher, both for grade school and high school, is something that she calls an ARE triangle. An ARE stands for argument, reasoning, and evidence. And according to what she says, they are triangles for a reason. They are not squares. They are triangles because they need the broad base at the bottom of evidence to support the reasoning and argument that come at the top. So the shorthand for this is that argument describes what you want to argue. Reasoning, the because question, describes why you want to argue it. What is your interpretation? And the evidence, the E, is how you're going to do that. What is the primary evidence that you're turning to support the arguments that you are making? So to help illustrate this, Lynn and I and a couple of other of our colleagues have put together a sample argumentation plan. This argumentation plan does not fit within the primary source packets that are available to you for very good reason. We are not modeling for you something that you could then use in your own work. We want this to be outside of that so you can see strategies that you might use, but that you don't feel swayed any one way, that you have to make the argument that we're making about the same primary sources. So I'm going to do a quick switch here and just show you some of these primary sources that we have put together. So you should all still be able to see this. This formatting should also look very familiar to you. This is the format that your primary source packets have come in. So you can take a quick look through this so that you know the sources that we are looking at, that we looked at in order to create a thesis statement and some sample sub-arguments. And we challenged ourselves just to take 1 hour looking at the Library of Congress resources to do some research to identify some primary sources about women's suffrage in the first centuries, or I'm sorry, in the first decades of the 20th century. So we found a handful of different kinds of sources and kind of went down different rabbit holes as we were doing our research, as many of us are wont to do. Doing that rabbit hole click, click, click when you see suggested sources is a really fun part of primary source research. And that's what we allowed ourselves to do here, is to be really curious about where one source might lead to another, or a question that might arise in our minds, like if this particular person is doing this in this year, what might be related to this? So this primary source packet is the product of our curiosity, of our research, but within a very constrained time frame, in that we gave ourselves just an hour to identify these. So you'll see that they're a mixture of photographs, newspaper clippings, flyers, and I'm going through these. If you feel concerned that you don't have enough time to look at them, know that all of these will be posted for you as a PDF, and it will be available at the close of tonight's session. So you will have full access to all of these sources so that you can review them. We have photographs of parades. And here's something that was really exciting for us. We found some sheet music. So this was something that surprised us. We weren't necessarily looking out to find sheet music that was relevant to the topic at hand, but we found some. And some other things that we found were some postcards with depictions of children. And we think about women's suffrage. We don't necessarily think about the impact on children or how children might talk about it. So our assumptions about the kinds of information that we would find were really challenged. And that continued when we found information about Chinese women who wanted to vote, Chinese American women who expressed the desire for a right to vote. We found a letter from Mary Church Terrell to her husband. And we found resources in places that we weren't necessarily expecting to find them. So for example, this is a photograph of a group of women who are holding a banner in support of suffrage at a National Baptist convention, so within a religious context. So that really challenged where we might find evidence about women asking for, demanding the right to vote. More newspaper articles and photographs. So all of these are at your disposal. And we're going to go ahead and go back here. So those points here really outline a lot of the things that I was talking about as we were doing that initial research. But what all of this and what my sharing about allowing ourselves to do that research kind of uninhibited, to follow those trails, to decide what made us curious, what made us ask other questions, is that what is of central importance in doing historical research for a class like this, for students doing a National History Day project, for the work that Dr. Hamner and other historians do, is that we have to let the evidence drive the thesis, not the thesis drive the evidence. So if you come into historical research with a certain kind of idea about what you're going to find, that's really going to encourage you to cherry pick, meaning you are going to select evidence that only matches what you have in mind with the thesis, the argument that you want to make. And it's important that we reframe that tendency to remain curious, to let the evidence always drive the thesis. So one way we can do this, and a way that we can remind ourselves that the evidence has to come first, is with something we like to call, and I'm sure lots of other people call, the bucket method. So you might do this by actually literally bucketing things or organizing physical printouts, pieces of evidence right in front of you. So what I have done is, based on the bit of evidence that you saw me scroll through in that primary source packet, what I was able to do was put everything out in front of me and decide, okay, an hour of my curiosity took me here. What can I do to start to organize this? So you can see these 3 different buckets that I decided it made sense to put these pieces of primary source evidence in. And based on the way that I was organizing them, I could start to make some arguments. And those arguments are on the top there, like leaders use the media to challenge beliefs, or leaders of the women's suffrage movement use public forums and put the debate about rights and whose responsibility it was to ensure those rights in the public eye. So this is just a demonstration of how organizing everything in front of you, categorizing it, can help start different arguments to be able to emerge. So based on this work that we did to organize, we were able to develop these sub-arguments that could help us create a thesis statement. So the thesis statement that we created was, from 1900 to 1920, national leaders of the women's suffrage movement used public forums, including parades, protests, and newspapers, to advocate for women's voting rights and fulfill their responsibility to push for democratic inclusion. However, the leaders of the movement did not fill their responsibility to ensure enfranchisement for all women, as the 19th Amendment did not guarantee equal voting rights for women of color or women living in U.S. territories. So let's take a look at the parameters that we have set out in assignment 2, assignment 3, assignment 4 about what makes a good thesis statement. So a good thesis statement should clearly state the topic. This thesis statement, I think, does clearly state the topic. It defines parameters. It gives a bracket for the time period, in this case, of information that we're looking at, which doesn't mean that there can't be evidence both before and after that would help flesh out a larger argument. But for these purposes, we're only looking from 1900 to 1920. There's a clear connection to the National History Day theme. So we see reference here to rights and responsibilities. And finally, it's an argument. It's not a statement of fact. This argument can be countered. Dr. Hamner and I could have a discussion about whether or not he thinks that the leaders did or did not fulfill their responsibility towards women of color and women living outside of the U.S. in U.S. territories. We could talk about whether or not the leaders of the movement strategically ignored those voices. So there is a lot of room here to be able to discuss and to prove what we are setting out to prove in the thesis in our sub-arguments, which brings me back to the buckets that we created, to those triangles in that ARE formatting that I shared. So here I have taken just a bit of the information from the buckets to show you how you can transform the organization of primary source evidence, photos of parades, photos of protest, women actively protesting, giving political speeches, distributing flyers, speaking out at church conventions, to come to this idea that leaders use public forums to talk about rights and responsibilities. So you can see here how we can shift from that organization of evidence to using that evidence as the basis of an argument. And here we can look through and just see how each one of those steps, each one of those buckets can help contribute to the creation of an argument that we can then slot into our argumentation plan. And you'll have access to all of these as a PDF after tonight's live session. So you can go through and look through all of this more carefully if you would find that helpful. Okay, so now that I've shared a little bit about how you can do some organization of your primary sources and your evidence, here's just a little bit about what you can look forward to the next couple of steps for this course. So the argumentation plan draft, and remember, this is a draft of a plan. So you're not setting out to do a full research project. You're just setting out all of the pieces so that you could do that someday. That is due about 10 days from today, on Friday, March 14th. Module 4 is going to launch that same day, Friday, March 14th. And in Module 4, the discussions are not going to be like our typical discussion sections. You are going to be doing peer review of each other's draft plans. And with the launch of Module 4, there will be more information for you all about timelines and what is expected of you. So starting March 14th, you will have directions for that. A heads up that Webinar 4 will be on Wednesday, March 26th. So Module 3 to Module 4 is a little bit of a compressed time period. So make sure if you haven't yet that you have registered for that and that is marked on your calendars, because we do have 2 webinars in March. Then after that Module 4 webinar, you will be able to revise and then submit your final plan. Plans will be accepted anytime from March 26th to April 14th. So there's a really extended period of time that you can use to dig in, to look at the responses that you got from your peers in the peer reviews, or to plan a one-on-one meeting with me, with your section facilitator, if you want a little more time to dig into doing that draft revision. And then finally, just to mark on your calendars, the final course survey will be due April 16th. So that still is a way out, but just information about what you can expect in the next couple of months. So as I said, there is this sample for you that will be available starting at the close of tonight's session. That is a full modeling of what this plan could look like based on this sample primary source set. Additionally, in the last iteration of historical argumentation, I would encourage you to take a look at how Lynn presents the ARE triangles. This is something that she developed for use within her own classroom. And to hear from her about the bearing that had on her teaching as well, you might want to check out Webinar 3. When we ran this course in the fall of 2023, and you can start that at the 30-minute timestamp. Okay, I just gave you a lot of information about working on your historical argumentation plan draft. So now I can open up the floor for questions, and Dr. Hamner, invite you back. We are just before our hour-long time mark. So for those of you who are on tight time schedules, you can follow the link, you can scan the QR code and complete your survey. Make sure that you do that for credit for being here. But for now, we are opening the floor to questions, and I see that we already have one. All right, so first question here. In one of the arguments that was modeled tonight, the word evil was used. And the observation here is that this is a value word. How should we treat words, terms that might have a social political value attached to them? How do historians deal with those questions?
So that might have been my example. I think that might have been Simon Legree. And I
Mm-hmm.
will tell you, so I think there's not a single answer of how you deal with these things, but I will say there are um, kind of nested answers. So I will tell you one way that you can never get into trouble, or it's very difficult to get into trouble, if you are using the word that people in the moment, at the time, at that place used. And so if I were to write that paragraph and say, Simon Legree became known as one of the most evil figures in American literature, that's not necessarily me making the value judgment. If I have a whole bunch of book reviewers or people who are writing newspaper articles about this book who say Legree is a towering, figure of evil. So it's they're making the value judgment, and I'm kind of passing it along in their words. Um, and so you can always do that. Um, the like to the extent that you are making value judgments, that I don't have a one size fits all answer for you. I think that many historians will try to be very careful about the kind of adjectives that they use to make sure that they are being very specific and very precise and that they're not throwing around language to just be inflammatory for the sake of being inflammatory. At the same time, it strikes me as a little bit dangerous to try to put everything in kind of flat, completely objective language because you're making there's an implication there too. And so what I try to do is think very carefully about the word that I'm using and my rationale for using it. So I think if somebody asked me, how could you use that word to describe this event? I want to make sure that I have an explanation and that I can give that explanation to someone who's skeptical. And if I can't, that's often an indication that I need to go back and consider my language and maybe, pick a different adjective or a different analogy that I can support. And I will say in my lived practice as a historian, this happens all the time. When I
Mm-hmm.
give public lectures, I always put up my email, and afterwards I will usually get between 6 and 12 messages from people in the audience who were interested or surprised and occasionally upset that I had used a particular word or a particular adjective to say something. And I want to make sure that I can say, oh, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I thought a lot before I used that word, and here's my logic for it.
Yep.
If you don't feel like getting into that, I think you can always dial back a little from inflammatory language. But in the case of Simon Legree, the people at the time who read the book, and I believe actually it's been a long time since I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, but I think that Harriet Beecher Stowe refers to him as evil. I mean, he is a caricature rather than a kind of fully realized person who's almost cartoonishly evil. And so I think referring to Simon Legree as evil is maybe more defensible than describing the owner of your rival sports franchise as evil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a follow-up question there about passing along the words of another author or a historian or a writer. Does that mean that it's no longer your argument?
It's often a part of an argument that I'm making. I think in the Simon Legree, in that paragraph, that was the all description
Yes, that was all
sample.
description.
So I was including that as a sort of statement of fact that
Yep.
he has become one of the most famous characters in um, in 19th century history for that reason. So that I don't think is an argument, but it
Right.
might be a fact that supports an argument, and I can point to a couple of arguments that use that observation that Legree is cartoonishly evil.
Yep.
One argument might be Legree's cartoonishly evil nature
Mhm.
aroused the righteous fury of a lot of Northerners, and that would be making an argument based on a fact. And
Yep.
you could make the same thing, white Southerners took great umbrage at the,
Mhm.
cartoonishly evil figure who was used to represent slavers in the South. So you're taking a fact, which is he's not very subtly presented in this very specific way, but then you could say the character of Simon Legree did more than anyone save for John Brown to drive the country towards civil war. Like now we are making an
Sure.
argument.
Yep. Yep. That was a great question to dig into. Thank you to our participant who shared that in the follow-up questions. That was a good pick apart. And thank you for taking that on, Dr. Hamner. There are a lot of layers there to consider. A nuts and bolts kind of question about the assignment. For this course, do we have to stick to only evidence that is found in the Library of Congress? For this course, yes, we do ask that you stick to primary sources, especially that you find using Library of Congress resources. So that can be the main catalog, that can be using Chronicling America. We have wonderful support from and we have wonderful resources in the Library of Congress. And the intention with this course is to utilize the abundance of resources that are there to make you well versed in techniques of searching their databases so that you are pros at using, finding, navigating Library of Congress resources. Of course, secondary sources can come from outside of the Library of Congress. And in those primary source packets that we have for you, you will find secondary sources from far afield. Okay. Just reviewing other questions here. All right, so we have a question that is about creating a National History Day exhibit. And the participant wants to know, how do you reconcile creating a wordy historical argument with just the 500 student created word limit for the entire exhibit? And what I will say is that perhaps the wordy historical argument doesn't have to be as wordy as it is. Perhaps there's opportunity there to do some serious refining, condensing, considering if maybe all of the component parts that are addressed in that argument need to be there. I know that when I have writing assignments that have a very short word limit, I will choose not to spend the precious words at the beginning setting out an argument that I then don't have the word count to be able to fully explore, defend, or otherwise discuss later on within that assignment. Dr. Hamner, are there any things that you do as a historian in a constrained assignment that help you to avoid wordy historical arguments at the outset?
It is so challenging. And in fact, at George Mason, we have a huge program in public history. So they are dealing exactly with this problem every day in the real world because you only have this much space to put your placard on the wall. So I can tell you what my colleagues who do this for a living do. And one of the things that I have seen, senior Smithsonian curators do is relentlessly edit.
Yep.
So they do not hold themselves maybe to 500 words at first, and they will sort of just kind of let's put everything we know down, and maybe that's 1,000 words, and then they will go to work at it. Is this absolutely essential? Is it important, or is it extraneous? Extraneous stuff goes immediately. If they're just interesting details, but they are not forwarding the argument, it's out. And then Much of the time, the stuff that's just, interesting or important has to go to or be dramatically condensed because you just have time to say the essential stuff. And so there's a real premium on not having flowery language, on, seeing, can I say this? This sentence is 16 words. Could I express the same idea in 8 words by just being short and snappy and direct? And can I cut out every single thing that is not relentlessly pushing forward my argument? I think it's a great exercise for anybody. It's made my writing better because anything that you can get out that is extraneous for your reader is work that you're saving them. And so the things that you leave in are going to hit with a lot more punch. So I don't try to fit everything on like a wall placard in my own work, but I do relentlessly go back and say, is this absolutely essential to the idea I'm trying to get across in this paragraph? Is this absolutely essential to the idea I want to get across in my introduction?
Yep. And I will say, I will qualify that that's painful work to
Oh,
leave
so
cutting
hard.
room
Yeah.
floor. Oh, it's
Uh,
devastating.
there's a famous quote where somebody says it's like murdering your children, like
Yeah.
cutting out these sentences
Yes.
that you wrote and labored over.
Yeah.
Um, but I will say it's hard, but it really pays off. And I have just gotten to the point in my own work. I'm not a great gifted writer by any means, but I'm having a pretty nice career as an author because I've turned myself into an excellent editor of my own work. So that first draft is not going to be great, and
Yep.
I'm okay with that.
Yep.
But I'm going to get my blue pen out and I'm going to go over a hard copy and I'm going to get rid of things and I am going to kind of clean away the dust and the dirt and the muck that's obscuring what I really want to say. And I
Yep.
think one of the great things that at every level of students I work with, including like my peers and people who are more senior to me, is everybody needs an editor. Um,
Yes.
and I know you said that tonight, but it's so true. Like everybody benefits from having a second draft, a third draft, somebody else to look at it. Your writing only gets better the more you work on it.
That strikes me that for the question asker, and especially for those of you who have students who are struggling with editing their own work or having their own work edited for a National History Day project, where those word counts are so tight and important, is telling them the amount of times that you're editing your thesis for this
Oh
course.
gosh. Yeah.
Just those bulleted points that I shared with you on Google Classroom, as I was outlining them, I thought, my goodness, this is so many iterations in a pretty short period of time, but that can only make your theses better.
The first time I did this course, some people were like, "Well, this is really helpful, but nobody has time to you would never do this to your own work, like go over it and over it and over it again." And I was working on a chapter at that point, and I scanned a couple of pages that I had edited up, and they had more blue ink on them than anything we were asking students to do because the work gets better. It's an effort, but also where I steal a lot of that time from is not worrying that much about my first draft. I know
Yep,
the first draft is going to need to be fixed. I don't spend a whole lot of time saying, "Oh, what's the perfect way to express this that's beautiful and elegant?" I say, like, get the idea on the page, come back to it. Um, and the exercise of reviewing other people's work, whether it's your peers in this seminar or whether it's your students reviewing each other's work, super useful too and super
yep,
helpful. Sometimes it's really great to get a different pair of eyes on whatever it is you're working on. It's really easy to get stuck looking at your own stuff. And
yep,
I will still all the time reach out to friends and colleagues and say, do you have an hour to read this and tell me what has to go or tell me how I need to rearrange it because I don't think it's working.
yep. We talk a lot about the skills that we hope to share with you all in this course as being a matter of practice, and certainly editing is a matter of practice. I know that I'm a better editor of my own work, having edited other people's work. I can kind of compartmentalize myself as my editor versus myself as my writer, and be a bit more ruthless, and not feel so bad about being ruthless. Um, Anyway, a question a little bit farther afield, but I think there are some good points here to talk about. If I can condense this a little bit, one of the participants is talking about race and its impact in sports. They're looking at Bill Russell and his accomplishments on the court. I assume Bill Russell is a basketball player by court.
One of the all-time greats.
I'm revealing too much about areas that I don't know anything about. Um, so arguments about whether or not Bill Russell would be a good player in today's league.
Oh,
And it,
I'm reading that comment, Barrett. I
uh-huh,
would love to take your sports and society course.
uh-huh.
It doesn't really feel like a question, but I think it really speaks to a bunch of things. First of all, kids today need to learn more about the history of basketball.
Not just kids today, adults today.
But you're not saying Bill Russell would be just another guy. Who is Bill Russell is a much more informed question than Bill Russell would be just another player. But I think, Derek, I mean, that in my class, that would feel like a teaching moment of you do know how to make arguments, right? You are comfortable saying, no, this guy would only be a middle of the pack NBA player. Well, show me your reasoning. Tell me about why. Here are my counter arguments. And I've noticed just kind of out in the world that people will kind of hear about historical arguments and say, oh, I don't know how to make arguments, or I don't have any interest in making arguments. Just tell me the facts. But then I flip on, sports radio or political talk radio, and people are making arguments all the time, and often sophisticated ones, and often ones that are well grounded in evidence. And so I think part of it is just sort of saying what you're comfortable doing this in a different context, and the sleight of hand is just kind of it's the same kind of thought process and a lot of the same skills that you're applying to, the past instead of, the NBA. Uh, but I've noted that that's a way to get students a little more comfortable in saying, well, just as you could have this argument about, pound for pound, who is the best heavyweight fighter of all time, start talking about, what was the most important labor strike of the last 25 years of the 19th century. Like it's the same kind of way that you're going to say, well, these things had this effect, these things had this effect. We're starting to weigh things. The skill set is, I think, broadly pretty similar. And I want you to give that student who said that Bill Russell would be nothing special today, give him my personal phone number and tell him to call me so I can set him straight.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. All right. We have, I think, one final question, unless anyone else wants to add anything into the Q&A box. What writers, historical or otherwise, are your influences? And especially stylistically? And I can share first. And I'm reminded of this because I'm putting together a reading list for another webinar that I'm working on teaching African American history. And a historian, a writer who's also a poet, who's also a teacher. He taught high school English for years. A writer whose work I really, really admire is Clint Smith. He's a contemporary writer. He wrote the book How the Word is Passed. Um, and it has incredible depth, incredible uh weight, gravity, but it's so incredibly accessible. When I read it for the first time, I immediately assigned it in the dual credit course that I was teaching. So I had high school 11th and 12th graders reading the work of a historical monograph. And it felt incredibly fulfilling to read it myself. And across the board, I mean, there were different levels of engagement that we were able to have, but it was accessible to everyone. So I'll say that Clint
That's
Smith,
a great one.
the first one.
I got a bunch. I'm teaching a graduate seminar on the Civil War right now. So Stephanie McCurry, who wrote a book called Confederate Reckoning, just blew my head off. Drew Gilpin Faust, who was the president of Harvard 2 presidents ago, has a wonderful book called This Republic of Suffering that's just so engaging and so beautifully written, but also so serious, and there's so much meat there. I've used David Blight's Frederick Douglass biography in a lot of the slides here as an example. He is a marvelous scholar and an incredible writer, and so good at taking complicated things and making them interesting and engaging and understandable. And then one of my all-time favorites was an English professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Paul Fussell, who was just a crank and a curmudgeon, and those are like my highest terms of praise for a scholar. He had no patience for people who were romantic about war. He had been in World War II, and he wrote very clearly and sometimes very profanely about what war did to people. And I read that book when I was in my early 20s, and I was like, this is the person that I would like to kind of grow into. but I'm never going to be anywhere near that good.
You've got a lot of time to practice.
I have some still, but that's a level, you're never going to be Bill Russell either. You should still
Yeah.
be working on your drills and your footwork, but aim for somebody great, and then in the effort you may max out your own ability.
I think we went through those pretty quickly, and we've gotten some requests to put those recommendations to share those recommendations. So, Dr. Hamner, I
Sure,
will email you to share those with me, and then I will
I
share them
will
with
happily
everyone
do
on
so.
Google Classroom. A participant wants to know if we have any thoughts on Hampton Sides book.
I don't accept that they are on my reading list for the summer.
Mhm. Yep. Okay. I think we have addressed all of the questions we could address. Are there any last minute pressing questions? Just a comment here that Blood and Thunder is a great book.
Oh, great.
Okay. So with that, I am going to stop the recording.